For years, the tension simmering beneath North American trade has been treated as almost invisible, a background hum of policy meetings and quiet negotiations that rarely reach the public eye. Economists and policymakers spoke in abstract terms, citing balance of payments or production quotas, while the real friction, the struggle for industrial sovereignty and leverage over cross-border supply chains, was largely ignored. It created a sense of inevitability, a feeling that these disputes were a natural consequence of globalization rather than the outcome of deliberate strategic choices. The American steel industry, long protected by domestic tariffs and subsidies, has enjoyed bursts of political attention during election cycles. But the day-to-day mechanisms of control, inspection, and enforcement have been largely invisible. Canadians, on the other hand, have increasingly sought to assert control over their own infrastructure projects and industrial planning, but their efforts were often dismissed in media narratives as minor bureaucratic adjustments rather than the opening moves of a strategic escalation. How could so much influence be wielded quietly, hidden behind the language of compliance and regulation, and yet have such explosive potential? The mechanics of this confrontation are precise and calculated. Canada, invoking clauses in its Import Control Act that allow intervention in sectors deemed essential for national interest, adjusted harmonized tariff codes to slow specific categories of U.S. steel. Each shipment now requires additional certification, verification of origin, and compliance checks that are not just administrative hurdles, but leverage points, carefully designed to create friction in supply without violating international trade agreements outright. On the American side, producers face not only delayed shipments, but an urgent need to restructure contracts, reroute logistics, and absorb costs that were previously negligible. Money moves differently in these moments. Cash flow for companies dependent on rapid inventory cycles becomes a strategic weapon in itself. The winners in this scenario are not immediately obvious. Canadian policymakers achieved temporary leverage and signal resolve to both domestic and international audiences. U.S. steel giants, for the moment, are caught in a liminal space between short-term profit expectations and the structural necessity of maintaining a predictable market. For the workers on both sides of the border, the stakes are visceral. Jobs can fluctuate with the rhythm of border inspections, and livelihoods are tied to the invisible hand of regulation. Yet the obstacle that could derail this carefully orchestrated strategy is equally real. A misstep in implementation, an overreach, or a sudden retaliatory measure from Washington could escalate tensions into a full-blown trade confrontation, disrupting not just steel flows but the broader North American economy. Imagine a construction company in Toronto forced to delay a bridge project because a shipment of rebar sits idle at the border, or a Pittsburgh mill temporarily shuttering its furnaces while waiting for paperwork that should take hours but now takes days. These are not abstractions. They are the immediate consequences of legal nuance and motion, a reminder that global policy is ultimately local in its impact. The broader geopolitical ramifications cannot be overstated. Every steel shipment blocked or rerouted sends a signal to other nations observing North America. Industrial sovereignty can be defended, markets can be challenged, and the rules are negotiable. It raises fundamental questions about governance, accountability, and the moral responsibility of those who control these levers. Citizens deserve transparency and foresight, not the comforting illusion that economic stability is guaranteed. The story of this shipment is not just about steel. It is a reflection of how power is exercised quietly, deliberately, and with consequences that ripple through every corner of society. The tension is not abstract. It is philosophical, structural, and deeply human. This is a struggle between two visions of order. Washington clings to predictability, to the idea that markets operate best under clear rules and that tariffs are merely tools to protect workers without disrupting the wider flow of commerce. Ottawa, however, refuses to be constrained by a distant logic that prioritizes efficiency over sovereignty. By asserting control over critical imports, Canada is signaling that industrial autonomy is a principle worth defending, even at the cost of short-term friction. Each block shipment is more than steel. It is a declaration that rules are not immutable, that supply chains can be leveraged, and that political and economic sovereignty is inseparable from the well-being of domestic industries. How long can the illusion of order persist when legal nuance becomes strategy? The technical underpinnings of this confrontation are as precise as they are opaque. Import certifications, harmonized tariff codes, and regulatory oversight form a lattice through which commerce flows. Interpose even minor delays, and the effects are magnified exponentially. A rebar shipment detained in Windsor does not simply sit idle. It triggers renegotiations of construction contracts, rescheduling of labor, and rising costs for complementary materials. The ripple is immediate, touching the lives of foremen, crane operators, steel workers, and even the office clerks calculating overhead in municipal planning departments. For every action, there is an equivalent reaction, a chain of human consequences, moving quietly behind the headlines. The winners and losers are not evenly distributed. Canadian regulators gain leverage, signaling resolve domestically and internationally. Domestic contractors experience a temporary shield against foreign price volatility, and Canadian steel producers can stabilize output under controlled conditions. Yet American producers, accustomed to smooth exports and predictable timelines, are forced to navigate uncertainty. Their workers confront sporadic overtime, temporary shutdowns, and anxiety of markets suddenly less predictable. Ordinary citizens, while removed from policy discussions, feel the effects and delayed projects, higher prices, and disruptions to services and infrastructure they rely upon daily. The friction intensifies when unexpected obstacles emerge. Legal ambiguity, bureaucratic bottlenecks, or retaliatory measures from Washington could escalate the confrontation, transforming a measured assertion of sovereignty into a headline-grabbing trade standoff. Every action carries both power and risk. One misstep could imperil the delicate balance, proving that strategic advantage in trade is as much about precision and restraint as it is about force. The lesson is stark and immediate. These maneuvers are not abstract numbers on a balance sheet. They are decisions that touch lives, livelihoods, and communities. How many citizens stop to consider that a block shipment in Windsor can ripple through a construction project in Toronto, affect a mill worker's paycheck in Pittsburgh, and reshape the planning of City Bridge? This is a reality of modern trade. Abstract policy decisions are inseparable from human consequence, and the philosophical contest between stability and disruption is felt in the tangible heartbeat of everyday life. What makes this move remarkable is how deliberately it exploits the gaps and nuances in the legal framework. The clauses invoked by Canadian regulators were never meant for routine trade disputes. They exist to safeguard industries deemed critical for national security or long-term economic stability. Most companies and even many policymakers barely notice them because they are hidden in technical appendices, buried under pages of legislative language that few read. Yet, when applied strategically, they become instruments of extraordinary leverage. By specifying the categories of steel affected, structural beams, rebar, and high-grade alloys crucial for infrastructure, Canada ensured that the bottlenecks would have immediate ripple effects, slowing construction timelines, reshaping procurement contracts, and forcing American suppliers to recalibrate their entire distribution networks. These are not abstract consequences. Every regulatory checkbox, every certification demanded, is a carefully positioned lever moving billions in value while leaving the impression of procedural normalcy. The mechanism relies on the interdependence of North American supply chains. Steel flows not just from smelters to factories, but through an intricate lattice of warehouses, shipping lanes, and industrial schedules that have evolved over decades. Interrupt one link, even subtly, and the effects cascade unpredictably. For example, a single shipment delayed at Windsor can ripple through a network of contractors in Ontario, delaying bridge repairs or high-rise construction, which in turn impacts subcontractors, laborers, and the manufacturers of complementary materials. It is an illustration of the butterfly effect in trade. The movement of a single container shapes the timing, costs, and decisions of countless actors along the chain. The immediate beneficiaries of this maneuver are clear. Canadian regulators gain leverage in negotiations, signaling to Washington that sovereignty over domestic industry is not negotiable. Domestic infrastructure contractors see a measure of protection from foreign price shocks, and certain Canadian steel producers, shielded temporarily from direct competition, can adjust production and plan investments with predictable domestic market. Yet for the American steel producers, and by extension workers dependent on these exports, the consequences are immediate and tangible. Disrupted schedules, cash flow pressures, and growing uncertainty about their role in a market they had assumed was stable. The tension is palpable because this chess move carries inherent risks. Any overreach could provoke retaliation, ignite a larger trade conflict, or invite scrutiny from the World Trade Organization. Miscalculations in paperwork or enforcement could transform a calculated lever into a point of contention, escalating what began as a subtle assertion of sovereignty into a headline-grabbing confrontation with consequences far beyond steel prices. In the human scale, this strategy manifests in lives delayed, plans deferred, and incomes impacted. A foreman in Hamilton waits for beams that have yet to clear customs. A young construction worker sees overtime vanish. And a small business must absorb costs rising unpredictably. What appears as legal technicality is, in reality, a set of tangible levers tugging on the everyday lives of ordinary people. And on the global stage, observers in Europe, Asia, and Latin America are watching closely, understanding that this is not a localized dispute, but a signal that modern trade is as much about strategic maneuvering and sovereign leverage as it is about free markets. The elegance of this move lies in its subtlety. To the untrained eye, adjusting a tariff code is bureaucratic minutiae, the sort of detail buried in government reports that nobody reads. Yet this adjustment is far from incidental. It is a deliberate act of strategic leverage. Each new requirement for documentation, each additional inspection or certification, acts as a friction point that slows the flow of steel across the border. Shipping schedules are thrown into disarray. Contracts must be renegotiated, and costs accumulate invisibly at every node in the supply chain. What seems like simple regulatory compliance is, in fact, a tool that reshapes market behavior. American producers, long accustomed to a predictable export rhythm, must now contend with delays, extra labor for paperwork, and the constant uncertainty of whether a shipment will clear customs on time. This is not chaos, but controlled disruption, a subtle recalibration of power executed entirely through legal and administrative means. The winners are those who understand and can exploit the system. Canadian regulators gain leverage without firing a single shot, demonstrating that sovereignty can be exercised quietly but effectively. Domestic steel producers, shielded from some immediate foreign competition, can adjust production, plan investments, and negotiate more favorable contracts, all under the cover of legal technicality. Contractors engaged in domestic infrastructure projects benefit from a measure of predictability in a market that is suddenly less vulnerable to external price shocks. Yet for U.S. companies, the story is starkly different. The delays translate into operational headaches, cash flow disruptions, and forced adjustments to establish supply chains. For the workers on the ground, the steel mill operators, forklift drivers, and shipping clerks, the impact is direct and tangible. Uncertainty over overtime, potential furloughs, and the stress of navigating a market suddenly rendered volatile. The tension lies in the fragility of the approach. A misstep, whether an overzealous inspection or a bureaucratic error, could provoke retaliation from Washington, escalate tensions into broader trade measures, or even draw scrutiny from international trade bodies. One procedural mistake can turn a carefully controlled strategy into a crisis, revealing just how fine the line is between leverage and disruption. On the human scale, the consequences are immediate. A construction foreman in Toronto may see project timelines stretch as steel deliveries stall. A small business supplying concrete forms faces rising costs that trickle down to consumers. Families awaiting the completion of infrastructure, bridges, hospitals, or apartment complexes experience delays, sometimes without even realizing that the source of disruption is a series of legal codes applied thousands of miles away. The lesson is unmistakable. In modern trade conflicts, power is often exercised through subtle, almost invisible channels, and the effects, while quietly executed, ripple through the daily lives of ordinary citizens. Globally, the message resonates. Other nations watching see that influence can be asserted quietly, legally, and effectively. Trade is not just supply and demand. It is strategy, leverage, and sovereignty in action. How prepared are citizens to understand the invisible levers shaping the economy they live in? The human impact is immediate and uncompromising. For the steelworker in Hamilton, each delayed shipment translates into idle machinery, shifting schedules, and shrinking overtime opportunities. A worker who counted on those extra hours to make ends meet suddenly faces uncertainty, a paycheck smaller than anticipated, and the nagging question of whether the plant will remain open for the week. Across the border in Pittsburgh, the scenario is mirrored. Furnaces cool earlier than planned, deliveries stall, and supervisors scramble to adjust production schedules. The stress is cumulative, almost invisible, yet relentless, moving quietly through families and communities. A single administrative decision at a border crossing ripples outward, touching lives in ways that are intimate, immediate, and often uncompensated. Construction projects illustrate the consequences on a larger scale. Bridges slated for completion are delayed, apartment buildings awaiting steel frames see costs rise, and infrastructure timelines stretch unpredictably. Municipalities and contractors, faced with these uncertainties, must absorb the rising costs, renegotiate contracts, and sometimes pass them on to homeowners. Taxpayers, unknowingly, become part of this chain of impact. What begins as a legal or regulatory maneuver becomes a lived experience, visible in higher bills, postponed projects, and disrupted schedules. Even small businesses feel the strain. A supplier of construction firms may face idle inventory. A transportation company sees trucks parked rather than moving, and accountants must adjust budgets to accommodate delays that were impossible to predict. The ripple effect extends beyond immediate labor and commerce. Families planning home renovations, businesses scheduling expansions, and communities awaiting improved infrastructure all encounter the consequences of a trade dispute they had no role in shaping. A steelworker's temporary layoff can cascade into delayed grocery purchases, postponed medical appointments, or deferred education costs. Each decision, each shipment delayed, has human consequences that intersect with daily life, reminding us that trade policy is not just abstract numbers. It is livelihoods, plans, and dreams suspended by forces largely invisible to the public eye. This human-scale perspective reframes the discussion entirely. The philosophical battle between stability and market disruption is no longer theoretical. It is a tangible struggle, felt in the trembling pulse of paychecks, in postponed projects, and in communities forced to adjust to circumstances beyond their control. Citizens often hear about tariffs or trade measures in distant headlines, but rarely experience the immediate consequences. Halted lines, rising costs, and the anxiety of uncertainty. How many people stop to consider that a shipment held at the border can dictate whether a family pays its rent on time or whether a young apprentice sees his first overtime? The lesson is unambiguous. Policy decisions, however technical, carry real, measurable human weight, and the lives of ordinary people are the most immediate instruments in which trade disputes are felt. The tremors of a single shipment ripple far beyond warehouses and steel mills, reaching the nervous nerves of financial markets with astonishing speed. Traders who deal in futures, commodities, and derivatives see the world differently. A delayed steel shipment is not a minor inconvenience. It is a signal that the predictable flow of goods, once taken for granted, can be disrupted at a moment's notice. Within hours, contracts are recalculated, positions hedged, and forecasts rewritten. Investors, watching North American supply chains, must adjust exposure and reassess risk. Even small shifts in the border can translate into currency fluctuations, subtle but significant, in the Canadian loonie and the U.S. dollar. What the public reads as a trade spat is, in reality, a complex choreography of expectation, calculation, and perception, where confidence itself becomes a commodity as fragile as steel. Yet these market reactions are not abstract. Each recalibration affects pension funds, insurance portfolios, and mutual funds, vehicles through which ordinary people's savings are invested. The consequences are compounded when businesses, small and large, adjust operations in anticipation of potential market volatility. A manufacturer may delay procurement, a contractor may postpone bidding, and a bank may tighten lending, all because the financial system interprets the border friction as a signal of risk. The illusion of a stable market is shattered not by chaos, but by precise legal and regulatory maneuvers executed thousands of miles away. Globally, the implications are even more profound. Nations observing this North American confrontation understand that sovereignty, strategy, and market leverage are deeply intertwined. Asian steel exporters calculate the likelihood of rerouted shipments. European infrastructure investors weigh the risk of sudden cost increases. Latin American manufacturers assess whether similar regulatory tools could influence their own competitive positions. A border inspection in Windsor becomes, in effect, a message sent to the world. Trade is never neutral. Supply chains are vulnerable, and legal sophistication can shift economic power without a single shot fired. The irony is striking. Media coverage often reduces these events to simplified narratives. Tariffs go up, trade tensions rise, markets react. But beneath that surface lies a labyrinth of technical rules, regulatory interpretation, and strategic calculation that few outside the corridors of power truly grasp. The stakes are not only economic. They are geopolitical, philosophical, and human. Citizens whose savings, jobs, and livelihoods depend on these markets rarely see the invisible levers being pulled, yet they feel the tremors in every delayed paycheck, every postponed construction project, and every increased cost of living. At its heart, this episode teaches a simple yet profound lesson. The perception of stability is as powerful as stability itself, and the tools of trade, legal codes, tariffs, and inspections can be wielded quietly, deliberately, and decisively, shaping markets, nations, and lives in ways most people never notice. The uncomfortable truth is that power is often exercised quietly, behind layers of legislation and technical rules that few citizens can penetrate. When a government invokes clauses to protect national interests or strategic industries, the action may be legally sound, economically strategic, and politically defensible, but it is rarely transparent. The public sees only the surface, headlines about delayed shipments, rising costs, or trade disputes. What remains hidden are the deliberations, the risk assessments, and the strategic calculus that determine which shipments will be blocked, which industries shielded, and how leverage will be applied. This invisibility creates a tension between governance and accountability, between effective action and the democratic principle that citizens deserve to know not just what is done, but why it is done. Transparency is not a luxury. It is a prerequisite for trust. When citizens cannot trace the consequences of policy decisions, they are left to interpret abstract events through the lens of personal impact. A family paying more for construction materials, a steelworker watching overtime hours disappear, a small business forced to adjust inventory. All are affected by decisions made in rooms far removed from their experience. Yet most will never know the mechanisms that created these pressures. How can a society claim to be truly democratic if its citizens are blind to the levers that shape their economic reality? Equally pressing is the question of fairness. Legal and bureaucratic sophistication can be wielded as power, but whose interests does it serve? In the steel dispute, Canadian authorities may achieve strategic gains. Domestic producers benefit from temporary insulation, and regulators demonstrate national resolve. But the cost is borne by workers, contractors, and consumers on both sides of the border. It raises a fundamental moral question. In a system designed to protect national interests, how do we ensure that ordinary people are not treated as collateral in a contest between abstract institutions and corporate imperatives? Citizens must not only observe these maneuvers, they must comprehend the consequences. Policy decisions reverberate through bank accounts, jobs, and future opportunities. Democracy requires an informed populace capable of questioning, analyzing, and holding decision-makers accountable. It demands that governments act not only strategically, but with ethical consideration for those most affected by their choices. In the absence of transparency and accountability, economic and political stability are illusions, maintained only until a single shipment, a minor regulatory adjustment, or a delayed steel contract exposes a human cost that has long been invisible. Ultimately, the lesson is clear. Governance cannot be measured solely by strategic effectiveness. It must be measured by the degree to which citizens understand, influence, and benefit from decisions made in their name. Otherwise, the machinery of trade and policy, no matter how sophisticated, risks becoming a quiet instrument of power rather than a servant of the people. This confrontation between Canada and the United States over steel is not just a dispute over tariffs or shipments. It is a mirror reflecting the fragility of economic systems and the subtle mechanisms through which power is exercised in the modern world. Stability is often taken for granted, as if markets are predictable machines that operate independently of human influence. But the reality is starkly different. Markets are built on a movement of people, materials, and decisions. They are communities of workers, contractors, families, and investors whose daily lives are shaped by legal codes, inspections, and regulatory interpretations. A single shipment held at a border, a minor adjustment to a tariff code, a delayed certification. These are not abstract disruptions. They're the levers to which real-world consequences manifest. It underscores a broader truth about modern power. It rarely arrives with fanfare or force. Instead, it is exercised quietly, subtly, often invisibly. Regulations, strategic legal interpretations, and administrative precision can shape billions of dollars in trade, redirect the flow of industry, and influence the livelihoods of ordinary citizens without a single headline making the mechanism obvious. The citizen, observing only the surface, may see a trade spat or tariff hike, but they rarely see the invisible chessboard where governments assert leverage, corporations respond, and workers adjust to the unpredictable rhythms of policy. And therein lies a moral imperative. If markets, governance, and policy are inseparable from human life, then vigilance is not optional. It is essential. Understanding is not a luxury. It is a safeguard against the erosion of economic agency and the quiet exercise of power. Engagement is not passive. It is the only way to ensure that decisions made in distant offices do not simply serve abstract interests, while leaving ordinary people to bear the consequences. Citizens must ask questions, demand explanations, and hold their governments accountable, not just for outcomes that are visible, but for the mechanisms that shape those outcomes before they are ever felt in bank accounts, job schedules, or community projects. Trade wars, in this light, are never fought solely over commodities like steel. They are fought in the balance sheets, the paychecks, the delayed projects, and the disrupted lives of everyday people. The story of a single shipment halted at the Canadian border serves as a reminder that the stakes of global commerce are profoundly human. Economic stability, political sovereignty, and market predictability are not abstractions. They are lived experiences. And the ultimate lesson is urgent and uncompromising. If citizens do not understand the levers of power, if they do not demand transparency and accountability, then the outcomes of these disputes will continue to be decided for them rather than with them. Vigilance, understanding, and engagement are not ideals. They are survival tools in the world of modern trade, where the human cost is the final arbiter of every decision.